tenured professor of psychology at University of Toronto. He was associate professor of psychology at Harvard. He's the author, co-author of over 100 pieces of psychology and neuroscience research, and then he got YouTube famous in 2016 for opposing Bill C-16, and then sold 1 million copies of his book, 12 Rules for Life. And there's been no shortage of criticisms of Peterson, as we know from this conference, but most of them didn't focus on his scientific arguments or like scientific bases for his criticisms. And that's what I want to focus on, because a lot of his arguments have an underlying scientific foundation that he doesn't really address, or he addresses insufficiently. So the first thing is, let's talk about lobsters and stuff. So yeah, one of Peterson's most popular scientific theories is this theory that social structures of lobsters characterized by territorial dominance and antisocial behavior laid an evolutionary track for our own neurobiology that established a tendency towards hierarchical social structures in our own species. So let's listen to Peterson's argument here real quick.
Tell us about the lobster. Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back. And it's an injunction to be combative, not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organize our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures. It's absolutely inevitable. And there is 1/3 of a billion years of evolutionary history behind that. Right? That's so long that 1/3 of a billion years ago, there weren't even trees. It's a long time. You have a mechanism in your brain that runs on serotonin that's similar to the lobster mechanism that tracks your status. And the higher your status, the better your emotions are regulated. So as your serotonin levels increase, you feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion.
Okay, so Peterson makes 3 key arguments here, and this criticism I'm doing has been made by a couple other people, but I think I do it a bit more thoroughly. So I think it's really important to our understanding of Peterson as a scientist. So I'm just going to kind of go over that ground again. So the 3 claims are that lobsters diverged from humans 350 million years ago. Lobsters and humans have a nervous system that runs on serotonin, and that there's continuity in animal and human societies. So let's address these one by one. The first one is that lobsters diverge. He misspeaks, he says divulge, and I think it's kind of funny to imagine like humans and lobsters like living on the seafloor and humans going up to them and being like, hey lobsters, we're actually humans. Divulging that information. But anyway, he meant to say diverged, but that's just false. He isn't misspeaking because he says this 350 million years figure other times. If we take a look at this phylogenetic tree, this is just like a breakdown of different like species groups. And this is us, vertebrata, right? And lobsters are a type of arthropod. If we trace it back, common ancestors around here, this is like 670 million years ago. And so it's like double. So you really fucked that up. And this animal, this is most likely a nematode. That looks like this guy right here, an acial. This is what's most likely the like current species living now that resembles that nematode we split off from. And the commonality we share with lobsters and with these guys is that our mouth is separate from our ass. That's really the commonality, is that we have intestines, which is Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's important, but it's also.
Evolution's a good developer.
Yeah, it's for real, like,
Objectively good.
for real, but like, this says nothing about our neurobiology or our social structure. So, cross that out. Second point, lobsters and humans have nervous systems that run on serotonin. I was gonna like explain how serotonin works really briefly, but I don't really have time. Yeah, sorry. So, this is wrong for a number of reasons. First of all, serotonin operates in concert with a whole host of other neurotransmitters. Serotonin's a neurotransmitter. It helps, you know, like neurological communication. And so, I mean, this is just a very, very basic misunderstanding of how neurobiology works. That even like a neuroscience 101 textbook that an undergrad would get, within the first third of the book, you would have no reason to believe this. Second, oh, and these are both organisms that use serotonin. They also run on serotonin. And I don't know, it's a banana. So also, serotonin functions differently based on its context. And this is kind of what I'm trying to outline with these different organisms, is that serotonin is just a useful chemical material. It doesn't have any functions intrinsic to us. For example, 90% of our serotonin is in our guts, and it regulates bowel movements. In the brain, it's associated with like mood, sleep, and appetite. But that's not the case for like lobsters or slugs and stuff. And importantly, high serotonin tends to make lobsters aggressive, whereas low serotonin tends to make humans aggressive. So it just kind of runs this idea that serotonin functions similarly in both organisms is just kind of ridiculous. And I won't even go over the antidepressants thing. He's just not being precise in his speech. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac work in lobsters, but they don't treat depression in lobsters. You don't even acknowledge depression as an illness lobsters can suffer from. So just be more precise, Ruben, please. Finally, this idea that there's continuity in human and animal society. So I was going to replay that clip, but let's just hustle through it. So let me say this. What Peterson is arguing here is that all animal species, or at least most, structure themselves similarly, and we can therefore draw generalizations from one species to another without really much more argument. And this is like just a really absurd generalization that ignores a bunch of species, like the bonobo, which is much, much more similar than we are genetically, because we only split off from them about 7 million years ago instead of 700. And guess what? Bonobos live in cooperative societies instead of dominant hierarchies like lobsters. And they often use sex instead of violence to resolve conflicts within their group, which we can see right here. And just to double down on this point that like Peterson seems to be like suggesting that most of nature is like inherently like antisocial and territorial, but that's like not the truth. There's a lot of cooperation that goes on in nature. And so this is a professor of biological oceanography at the University of Washington, and says the role of unbridled violence in evolution is greatly overestimated. When we see animals like elephant seals fighting with each other, as we do in lots of nature documentaries, we're really seeing only a very small sliver of time. Much more of the time they're accommodating each other and respecting where the boundaries are, and that's cooperation. There's a tremendous amount of cooperation in nature. Cool, so. Also, Peterson seems to suggest the older a trait is, the more prevalent it must be in nature. That's what he's kind of saying with the, this behavior is 300 million years old. There weren't even trees then. That just like misunderstands how evolutionary biology works. The more time we've spent evolved separate from another group or another species, the more different we're likely to be. And so like that's why we're much more different than we are bonobos. And yeah, it's weird. It's kind of like a weird like naturalistic fallacy, but like completely misunderstanding how nature works in doing so. So now we've addressed the evolutionary biology stuff, and that now let's get into gender and sex. So as many of you know, Peterson grew quite popular after his controversial opposition to Bill C-16 of the Canadian legislature. They aim to protect trans and gender non-binary people from discrimination by adding them to the list of protected classes alongside other political minorities, such as ethnic and religious groups. Peterson argues that Bill C-16 and legislation like it would make it illegal for him to misgender a student, for example, by referring to a woman as he or a gender non-binary person as she. And there's been a lot of good work addressing Peterson's legal concerns, but I would like to focus on the scientific foundation that he built his argument on, but doesn't really address fully, or almost at all. So, Peterson's argument is built on the presumption that gender and sex are strict binary systems, meaning that you can either, in regards to gender, be a man or a woman, or in regards to sex, be female or male. And let's see. He also misrepresents a bunch of data to bolster his point. So let's jump into the gender stuff first. Let's listen to, this is from a lecture series he put out. This is where he got popular. It's called Professor Against Political Correctness. These are his slides, not mine. Come on,
There's an idea that there's a gender spectrum, but I don't think that that's a valid idea. I don't think there's any evidence for it. Biological sexuality is ancient. It's hundreds of millions of years old. And it's binary because there's two forms of biological sex. Now, of course, this is predicated on the idea that your gender is somehow independent from your biological sex, but that's a proposition, not a fact. And even if it's true, even if the matter was determined to be true, it is certainly not determined to be true to that degree now, and certainly not to the degree that it should be instantiated in law. At most, it's an opinion, and I think it's an ill-informed opinion.
So this is as far as Peterson goes into the literature on gender and sex in his entire argument. He literally just says that there's an idea that there's a gender spectrum, and he doesn't think that it's a valid idea, and he doesn't think there's evidence for it. And we just have to take him at his word that he knows what he's talking about. So there's no transparency. We can't actually, he doesn't present an argument, he just presents a conclusion. So, I mean, there's really nothing to work with here. And also, this is a YouTube video on his own channel. You know, he could have gone into it as much depth as he wanted. So, burden of proof's on him. I'm not going to really address it right now. I don't have the time. That we can have a long discussion about gender and sex. But let's continue. So now Peterson then goes on to address the idea that sex is also a spectrum, that there's more than just male and female, or male or female. And so let's watch this real quick. Come on.
More definitions. Sex is the anatomical classification of people as male, female, or intersex, usually assigned at birth. I should also point out that the class of intersex is so rare to be virtually non-existent. And it isn't reasonable to make standard policy on the basis of extreme exceptions. And the reason for that is that there are myriads, millions of extreme exceptions. And it's not possible to constitute a collective society on the basis of legislation that's designed for exceptions. It can't be done by definition. The law is fundamentally there to produce a collective agreement.
Okay, so I just want to, I forgot to say that these are definitions from the Ontario Human Rights Commission's website, so he's criticizing this definition of sex that includes intersex. And he's doing so very fallaciously. He's arguing that because intersex people make up some small percentage of the population, that we can therefore disregard them. This is the tiny percentage fallacy. But second of all, intersex people make up about 1.7% of the population, which is about the same as redheads. And it's also about the same as Jews, Sikhs, Buddhists, Arabs, or Latin Americans in Canada as well. So it's just kind of ridiculous. Like, most liberal people would probably believe that if there is some sort of minority group that is being discriminated against or not represented, there probably should be some legal protection for them. And then, I went over the tiny percentage fallacy. And this is really important because again, Peterson's argument here rests on this kind of scientific basis and this model of sex that we have. And so the kind of standard model that we're taught is that we just have female and male, right? It's just binary, and then intersex people are just some outlier that we have to disregard. But it's like quite a big part of the population, and it also really discredits this binary model. And so Peterson needs to like discredit this population in order to make his argument. But I don't think he really can reasonably discredit that population. And I'll just say that, like, yeah, that's it. You know, we have models of sex and gender. Nature